Everyone, I'm Kyle Pierce, and this is the definitive guide to Saturn in Aries. So this is not only one of the most important astrological events of the year, it promises to have profound influence over the next 2 to 3 years, as we are going to first get Saturn's ingress into Aries on May 24th, 2025, where we will spend the summer getting to know Saturn in Aries firsthand. It will then retrograde back into Pisces September 1st, 2025, and will re-enter Aries for good this time, just in time for Valentine's Day on February 14th, 2026, where it will painstakingly and methodically grind its way through Aries until it enters Taurus April 13th, 2028. So whether it's your Saturn return or you have other important planets or houses that are likely to be affected by Saturn's ingress into Aries, or if you're just looking to see how this is likely to play out within the world at large or within the lives of people close to you, stick around. We're gonna go over all the dirty deets and more. So in order to understand what it means that Saturn is moving into Aries, we need to first understand what Saturn represents. Saturn is a planet which represents boundaries, limitations, and at its core, the end of all things, right? Or the end of what we can see, which is why Saturn has an association with death. Everybody has Saturn in their chart, and everybody will eventually die, right? These are the kinds of things that Saturn makes us aware of. Yes, we are alive right now, but there is a limit to how long we will be alive. Some of us have longer to be alive than others, and some of us have a greater range of capacity to do things within that allotted span of time that others do not. Inherent to the symbolism and meaning of Saturn and what it does when it enters a sign or begins to aspect another planet, there is an introduction of an awareness of limitation, whether it be time, the most precious resource of them all, or another resource like money, like food, like will to live, or energy, vitality, right? We may have, 16 hours in a day to accomplish any number of tasks, but we have a limit to how much energy we have to accomplish different tasks. Accomplishing tasks takes not only time, and it takes not only energy, but it also takes skill of some kind. Most people that you meet tend to find some things easier to pick up than other things. Me, for example, I'm not great at math. When it comes to math, it might take me hours or days to learn a math-related skill, while it might take Jimmy over here 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. For the most part, I'm probably going to want to avoid putting myself in situations where math is demanded of me on a consistent basis. While it may be that if push came to shove, I could slog it out, figure out the math, get the job done eventually, it's just not a very efficient way for someone like me to live, right? While it may be very beneficial for my friend Jimmy over here to put himself in lots of situations that require math, because he's good at it, he'll be competitive, right? He'll be able to learn lots of math really fast and achieve high levels within the math world. Suffice it to say that Saturn also represents these kinds of limitations as well, personal limitations. And recognizing our personal limitations, while not always pleasant, helps us make our decisions about how to best use our limited time on Earth. Saturn is also traditionally associated with consequences, the natural and inevitable result of one's actions. When we are working with the Saturn part of our consciousness, we are trying to do the calculus of, if I do this, then this will happen. If I drop a 15-pound bucket of paint on my friend Jimmy's head, there's a high probability that his head will crack open and he'll die. So I probably don't want to do that, right? Boy, howdy, I'm sure glad that Saturn was around to tell me that. Now, no matter what sign a planet is in, that planet is always trying to do things of the nature of itself, right? It's has a built-in set of needs and desires which it wants to fulfill. Saturn wants to build walls and wag his finger at people, tell them what they shouldn't be doing and why they shouldn't be doing it, and what will happen if they do it. But whenever it enters a different sign, it encounters a different set of expectations and a different set of resources in order to fulfill its needs and desires. When a planet is in its own sign, a sign that we would call a domicile, it finds itself in rather fortunate circumstances because it finds itself in a place that expects of that planet exactly what it's naturally suited to doing, which is great. If we're Jimmy and we're really awesome at math and we find ourselves in a physics lab or an engineering think tank or something, Jimmy will probably get a promotion really fast and everybody will like him because Jimmy's going to be so useful to what they're trying to do there. And Jimmy's going to love it because he gets to do what he loves. And he has all the calculators and compass thingies to do it with. Now for Saturn, it has the signs of Capricorn and Aquarius, which Saturn calls its domiciles, which are said to be ruled by Saturn. If Saturn is in either of those two signs, it gets to do Saturn things all day, up and down, left and right, boundaries and walls and prisons, and alienation for days. But some signs are more welcoming to a guy like Saturn and his particular skill set than others. At the time of recording this, Saturn has been in Pisces for the last 2.5 years. And generally speaking, Pisces doesn't tend to have the kinds of things that Saturn likes to play with. It doesn't have hard, solid earth and bricks and heavy metals to build stuff out of like it does in Capricorn, or stagnant social frameworks to be critical of like it does in Aquarius. In Pisces, we're dealing with the liminal space between our perceived reality and what lies beyond, or the all-encompassing expansive ocean, which, while you may be able to draw a square on a map and say that that's the hamburger part of the ocean, or whatever, there aren't any discernible landmarks to identify that when you're sailing through it. And like, what is a water? For Saturn's purposes, it has sort of awkward tools to work with in Pisces. Its skill set and the workload demanded of Saturn in Pisces is not a great match, not a perfect match. That doesn't mean that we can't figure it out over time. Saturn's pretty great at that. It's forcing us to make do with what resources we have available to us. But now we are entering a new sign, where Saturn's going to spend about 2.5 years grinding through Aries. So to understand that, we got to understand the relationship between Saturn and the sign of Aries. And to understand that, we got to talk about Aries. So what is Aries? Aries is a cardinal fire sign. It marks the beginning of spring in the tropical zodiac, and then in terms of the constellation that it's associated with, it is signified by the ram. And those two details will tell you a lot of what you need to know about Aries. Just like spring, Aries is initiatory. It is the introduction of heat to a situation that is meant to get things going. It sets things in motion, provides enough heat to entice the little saplings out of the ground. The seeds that are now warmed up enough to start shooting their little ropey stems towards the sky to break through the soil. That takes a lot of initial energy to overcome the resistance, to bring what is latent or hidden into visibility, into being. It's what Aries is all about. It's about assertion, asserting yourself into the world, whether or not anybody welcomes you. You also might get a hint from the zodiac, or the animal association with the constellation of Aries, the ram, that there might be something kind of aggressive about Aries. Rams are known to suddenly charge at figures that they find threatening, or at other rams to prove their dominance over the other ram and compete for the right to mate with the lady sheep, right? Most of the time when you see a ram, they're just eating grass, they're chilling, they're hanging out. They don't spend all day butting heads with other rams. That would take a lot of energy and just be a very inefficient use of their time. Ideally, they butt heads with one of the other rams once, show them who's boss, and now they're left alone to do their thing. And everybody knows that that ram is the champ, right? So when we introduce Saturn to Aries, what happens? What are the expectations in Aries, and how suited is Saturn to meet those expectations? Well, in Aries, we're expected to put in effort. Saturn gets that. Saturn gets effort. Saturn's about doing what you got to do to survive. But Aries demands sudden, immediate action and overwhelming force. Enough force to break through, right? To overcome, to secure whatever position you're trying to secure and bask in the glory. And while Saturn is about effort, Saturn is about sustained effort. Saturn's mode is to look at a problem and go, oh, I don't want to do that. It's going to be such a pain in the ass. Well, if I got to do it, what's the least amount of effort I can apply to the situation? Because I only have so much energy, right? We got to be efficient about this. Because again, I'm thinking about the long term. If I'm Saturn, I'm thinking about making sure I have enough to last me into the future. Saturn is about measured, controlled, sustained, and efficient effort. Aries is about throwing everything you got at it and overwhelming the issue with everything you have, and just hoping that that's going to be enough to permanently wipe out the issue. And here's maybe where we start to run into some of the trouble with Saturn and Aries. Because while Saturn may not like having to use overwhelming force, if it has to do it, it'll do it. But how can I use the overwhelming force in a way that makes it so I don't have to work all the time, so that I don't have to put in effort all the time? Well, I can punch Charlie in the guts and make sure that he knows who's boss and doesn't dare to ask me to pay for milk ever again. You see, the thing with Saturn in Aries specifically is that it is traditionally considered to be the sign of Saturn's fall. Each of the planets has a sign that elevates them, raises them up, brings out their best virtues. Those are the signs of their exaltation. For Saturn, that's Libra, because we all like rules a lot better when they're fair, when they take parties into account. We all like laws and order when it's established under equitable terms or with consent, because it's actually a lot easier to maintain harmony and fair dealings between people and equitable relations when there's a codified set of rules and standards to uphold. One of the things that Saturn will speak to is the feeling of shame, the feeling like we don't measure up to something. Shame is also a very effective tool in controlling behavior, and it tends to be an especially effective tool for maintaining order within cultures and civilizations, by getting everybody to be polite and play nice. We would rather set the system up so that you feel bad about it, rather than having to put you in prison every time that you step out of line.
How would you feel if somebody told you you couldn't dance?
Why? That would hurt my feelings.
Maybe you just don't do it because you recognize that it's not very nice or not very fair, and you would feel bad about it if you did it anyway. In Aries, however, we're not about this being civil and fair and equitable. We're about doing what I want to do, guys. I want to go to Taco Bell. I don't really care if you guys don't want to go to Taco Bell, because Taco Bell's great. And if you don't think that Taco Bell is great, well, you. I'm in Aries, where I do what I want, and actually, when you see how enthusiastically I devour this chalupa, you're gonna want a chalupa too. I'll show you the way. Actually, Taco Bell makes me so strong, and you're gonna wanna have Taco Bell because you're gonna see how strong it makes me. Right? That's what we're doing in Aries. We're testing our capabilities against objects of resistance. We're showing who we are and what we're capable of by demonstrating it. And this is essentially cuts to the heart of why Aries tends to bring out the better virtues of the sun, right? Traditionally, Aries is said to be the sign of the sun's exaltation, which just means that the useful pattern gets reinforced by being rewarded, while the less useful patterns don't get rewarded. But the sun likes Aries because we're supposed to lead by example in Aries. We're supposed to take action based on our own beliefs, our own will, to test ourselves and discover who we can become. In Aries, we have to prove ourselves as leaders by being the best, being the most suited, being the most fit to rule. Aries is the sign where spring starts, where the day starts to become longer than the night. So who better than the sun to lead the charge into the great diurnal takeover of the world? But the reverse is true for Saturn. Saturn is the archetypal opposite of the sun. While the sun is at the center of the solar system, Saturn is on the periphery. It's the dimmest, it's the least visible of all the 7 traditional planets. So it is the Lord of Darkness, in a sense. Its signs, Capricorn and Aquarius, are situated in a part of the zodiac that is associated with winter. So Saturn's discerning and restrained nature goes great during the winter because there's just not a lot to go around. So you need to ration what is available. You need to carefully conserve your firewood so that you don't run out and freeze to death. A raging bonfire will keep everybody super warm for one night, but if you burn all the firewood, you're just as dead tomorrow. So this attitude towards things is very useful in situations of scarcity, the demand restraint, the demand being critical and negating. Saturn's role is to say no to things, right? Or to say, not yet, you're not ready, or no, you can't have a bonfire tonight because we'll run out of firewood by the end of the week. So in Aries, we're in springtime, we're anticipating abundance ahead. Our decision tree is sort of built around the expectation of abundance on the other side. So all you got to do is just throw everything you got at it, and if you come out on top, great, you get the gold. So we like the sun in Aries because the sun is the illuminator. It shows you the way. It shows you what you're capable of or inspires you. You see, that guy did that. All he did was believe in himself and put everything he had into it, and he came out on top, right? I can do that too. It inspires us to do things, to give ourselves a shot. Aries doesn't promise victory, right? But it does push you into the ring. You don't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket, right? And this is a quality that we like in leaders, in solar figures, because we like to follow somebody who has proved themselves, who has put in the work, done the time. But with Saturn being the sort of inverse principle when it enters Aries, we very often see issues around leadership or challenges to authority. Because while ideally in Aries, we're inspiring others to go to Taco Bell with us, with Saturn in Aries, we might be making it a law that everybody has to eat tacos at Taco Bell at 3 o'clock every day. Why? Because I fucking said so. We'll often see Saturn in Aries showing up when there are tyrannical or dictatorial type figures coming into prominence, or sometimes within the charts of dictatorial type people. One of my favorite Saturn in Aries examples is the birth chart of Peter the Great, who was the Tsar of Russia in the late 1600s, early 1700s. He assumed the throne at a very young age. Russia was at the time very much a backward-facing nation on the periphery of Europe. Their military, though large, tended to be poorly equipped, used medieval-style tactics, and they were just getting their asses handed to them in wars. And worst of all, they got no respect from their European neighbors. And to a large degree, the Russian aristocracy liked it that way. They liked doing things the old way, the Russian way, which involved this very cumbersome bureaucracy. In Europe, governments were centralizing. Kings were slowly taking more and more power away from the lesser lords, the nobility, and consolidating power around themselves and the bureaucratic institutions of the central government. And Peter the Great saw that and said, cool, I want to do that too. I want to be all-powerful. I want to make Russia great. And he is famous. He's called the Great because he was successful. However, he had to drag his country kicking and screaming through that process. During the Great Northern War, where Peter the Great and a coalition of nations all ganged up on the Swedish Empire, which was kind of the big dog at the time in Northern Europe, and had edged out Russia from the Baltic Sea. So in order for Russia to ever become a European power, they were going to need access to the Baltic Sea. And so during this war, even though for the first half of it, Russia was essentially getting their ass kicked, like they were losing battles over and over again, but the Swedish army wasn't big enough to defend against all these just massive mobs of soldiers that Russia kept sending in. So early on in the war, Peter the Great and the Russian army managed to secure a tiny slice of swampland on the far eastern coast of the Baltic that still officially belonged to Sweden because no treaties had been signed, and it would continue to legally belong to Sweden for the next 2 decades or so. But from day one, Peter the Great started building a city in this swamp. Nobody wanted to live there. There was no real economic activity in that region, but Peter the Great just kept sending Russian peasants to go work on building the city, draining the swamp, developing this land. Really, in the first few years of Russian occupation, he managed to establish a substantial city for the time, but it involved the deaths of tens of thousands of peasants as well, just in the construction process, just in the not being able to get decent resources to the city. And it was really just by sheer brute force that he managed to build a city which would become, for a time, the capital of Russia, St. Petersburg. And for the record, St. Petersburg was founded when both Saturn and Neptune were in Aries, very much like the ingress that we're seeing today. And the reason I tell the story is because I think it's a good example of how Saturn in Aries really tends to work. This is often the case with falls in general, is that very often they're able to achieve results, but it tends to come at a very high cost. And it absolutely did for the nation of Russia during the Great Northern War, and it ended up setting a precedent for a style of leadership that very much carries on in Russia today. Now, just as you can and often will see Saturn and Aries showing up around the topics of tyrannical leadership or leaders taking things too far in order to assert their dominance or to conquer new land or to impose their authority over others, it often comes around when leaders are asking too much of the people. And so Saturn in Aries also describes the reaction to the perception or experience of tyrannical rule, of oppressive authority, which is very often a distrust of figures or even systems of authority. And it speaks to the nature of a planet in its fall, like Saturn is in Aries, is that while you can get results, the results often come at a high price, both personally and externally, and it can bring out kind of bad behavior, right? And so sometimes the response is to just kind of give up. Like, well, my experience of structure and authority and discipline has been pretty bad. So maybe structure and authority and discipline just aren't for me. Maybe it's not for anybody. Maybe we should do structure, authority, and discipline. And so you'll get a result, which I think is best exemplified by the period when Saturn was in Aries during the late 60s, when the United States was involved in a war in Vietnam that the people didn't agree with, that the people felt like was wasting the lives of Americans and the lives of the Vietnamese people as well. And so that reaction to the experience of the government as oppressive resulted in what we call today the counterculture movement or the hippie movement. That really got started when Saturn was in Pisces. And if you want to know more about that, you can check out my video on Saturn in Pisces, which I did, 2.5 years ago now. But when Saturn got into Aries, it really became more of a mainstream movement and kind of culminated during the Summer of Love, which is kind of an ironic name for a period that actually ends up describing Saturn and Aries extraordinarily well. And I think it is in part because the Summer of Love officially began with a conjunction of Venus and Jupiter in Leo. I think Ceres might have had something to do with it as well, but both planets were in a trine relationship with Saturn and Aries, which really promoted this experience that was very much the result of an agreement with Saturn and Aries that systems of authority, government structure, disciplines, maybe all of the social and cultural structures which have been in place and in controlling our behavior for God knows how long, need to go too.
Giant protests were not even so much the soldiers as their mothers. Because what the hell is my boy doing in Vietnam?
And so for a time, people kind of threw off the shackles of social expectation and constraints and openly flouted not just the government, but the social and cultural expectations of their elders. Saturn speaks to the elderly, the ancient, the long-standing. And it was a sort of collective rejection of all those things, which I think many of us would agree were ultimately very important. contributions to the current culture and were crucial to making mainstream both women's liberation, equal rights, but to the great disappointment of many hippies at the time, the summer of love only lasted one summer, right? And it quickly fell apart because it didn't essentially offer a stable, coherent structure in place of the one that was being attacked or dismantled. That's why a lot of former hippies ended up wearing ties and chasing the American dream in the 80s, because a lot of the experiments with different mechanisms for social organization, such as communes, right, they didn't necessarily work out the way that they had hoped. A lot of the people that left home to go live on hippie communes found that there wasn't really a good system for making sure everybody was fed. Healthcare wasn't really well established. It became fertile ground for the rise of different cult leaders, such as Charles Manson, right? Where in the absence of government-enforced order, these kind of pop-up communes or little mini attempts at building a utopian society pretty consistently ended in failure. And this is something that we will often see with Saturn and Aries repeatedly throughout history, is these kind of slapshod attempts at rolling out a new structure, rolling out a political reform, or a large-scale project like building a city. Or like in 1850, while Saturn was in Aries, the Compromise of 1850 was essentially a series of legislative measures passed by the U.S. Congress, which were intended to diffuse regional tensions between the North and the South by allowing slavery to continue to exist in southern states where it was practiced, and basically creating a border between the North and the South that extended into the frontier, which allowed territories south of that border to decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to allow slavery, but abolished it north of that line. And while it was an attempt to diffuse the tensions between the North and the South, it actually ended up aggravating them even more. In an effort to avoid a war, to Saturn a conflict, by implementing the legislative equivalent of cardboard to patch over a hole in the wall, it essentially kicked the can down a decade and resulted in an even bigger conflict. This is sometimes what you'll see with Saturn and Aries, is a refusal to really assess what is needed in a given situation, to look at the reality of what is actually maybe a very big and deeply entrenched structural problem, or social problem, or cultural political problem, and do things which are reacting to a short-term crisis rather than addressing the long-term issue. In Aries, we're feeling that sense of urgency, feeling like we need to do it now. And it's part of one of the things that can be confusing for Saturn and Aries, because the nature of falls is that that sign forces them into what can often seem like lose-lose scenarios, where by meeting the expectations of the moment, I undermine my own priorities, my own needs, if I'm Saturn, to be disciplined and slow and methodical and think about the long term. But if I do the thing that is my nature to do, to be slow and methodical and critical and discerning, I end up not being fast enough to react to the situation at hand. And this is the challenge that people with Saturn in Aries in their birth charts often experience, is this pressure to do more than what is possible, or what they're capable of, or what is realistic. And they often run into a situation where they agree to take on burdens that are beyond their capacity or not able to be accomplished with the resources that they have. As in Aries, we have that pressure to say, yeah, we can do that. Yeah. Because the fact of the matter is that the kind of situations that Aries introduces are sometimes things that are kind of one-shot deals, or if you don't seize the moment, you miss. Or if you don't do it now, it never gets done. It's not a simple equation to navigate. While sometimes Saturn and Aries can give you this kind of image of somebody who rejects discipline or rejects responsibility, very often people with Saturn and Aries are extremely hardworking, and they take on more than they can chew, and they burn themselves out in the process. So another thing you'll often see with Saturn and Aries is that because Aries represents qualities that tend to be more youthful in nature, that impulsivity, that vitality, the early phases of things where energy and potential are at their max. So for this reason, you will often see Saturn in Aries describing the experience of being introduced to great responsibility at an early age. Peter the Great was made czar of one of the biggest countries in the world at, I think, the age of like 9 or 10. And not only is that an enormous amount of pressure and responsibility to put on a young person, it's also a lot of burden and responsibility to put on somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience, right? So making somebody responsible for the well-being of many or for the leadership of many when they're perhaps not ready or not experienced enough to take on those responsibilities. It's also a way that being introduced to responsibility at a young age has a way of crushing your individuality or your spirit, in a sense. When you're young, you're supposed to try different things with all the energy and enthusiasm of somebody who doesn't know that they could fail, right? Saturn can potentially bind you to responsibilities which are not of your own making, which are not even compatible with who you are on an individual level. So we'll often see with Saturn and Aries this kind of struggle around individuality, the personal, the individual will or spirit, oppressed or contained by forces outside of themselves, by structures, or by sometimes the physicality of our being, by being born maybe smaller or weaker. If you've ever seen the movie Gattaca, it's one of my favorite movies.
In a society where success is determined by science, one man's only chance
How do you expect to pull this off? I don't know exactly.
is to hide his own identity
This is the last day that you're gonna be you and I'm gonna be me.
by borrowing someone else's.
Congratulations.
So the movie's essentially about his quest to become an astronaut, even though by nature of who he is, isn't allowed. So he takes on the identity of another. This is something you can see with Saturn in general. As much as Saturn tells you what things are, Saturn, as the Lord of Darkness, carries the significations of ignorance or deception. And especially with Saturn and Aries, we might feel pressured to craft a facade of capacity or of confidence or of success, which may not match the material structure behind it. Like in the movie Gattaca, maybe we have to convince everybody that we're healthier than we actually are, more vital, more insert here than we actually are. But what I love about that movie is the message is about perseverance. It's about the power of the human spirit to overcome adversity. And this is very much one of the positive things you can see with Saturn and Aries as well. It can present obstacles to our will, to accomplishing what we want to accomplish. It can force or bind you to the accomplishment of a goal, and you can really get a strong quality of persistence or willingness to endure more than most in order to achieve your goals.
How are you doing this, Vincent? How have you done any of this? You want to know how I did it? This is how I did it, Anton. I never saved anything for the swim back.
There is a quality that I've seen time and time again in people with Saturn in Aries that, in all honesty, I find not only admirable, but truly inspiring. And it's really this quality of being not just willing to try, regardless of the odds against them, but almost a internalized sense of it being mandatory. The giving up just isn't an option. It's this ability to say no to their own limitations. This is, in a sense, Saturn saying no to itself. That even if the world says no to me, even if my body says no to me, I'm gonna keep going anyway. So when you combine that overwhelming force of Aries and the sustained effort of Saturn, sometimes you get something that's truly unstoppable. Saturn and Aries people have this ability to say no to gravity, to defy gravity itself. And even if they fail over and over again, they often have this grit, this stubborn and sometimes foolish will to defy the limitations imposed upon them, regardless of the consequences. And it's this quality that can make Saturn and Aries a real superpower. And while I consider it my duty as an astrologer to be realistic about what the dangers and pitfalls of a placement or transit like Saturn and Aries are, and it probably seems like I've been ragging on Saturn and Aries this whole video, that willingness to throw caution to the wind, to defy limitations, can and has pushed people to do incredible things. In fact, humanity first flew to the moon and back when Saturn was in Aries. While it was an incredibly expensive program, And there were many failures leading up to that eventual success. And one could argue that nothing was necessarily really accomplished. We didn't come back with a cure for cancer or huge loads of minerals or resources of any kind. It accomplished something symbolic. It accomplished us showing ourselves that we are capable of breaking free from the gravity of this planet, from limitations which nature has imposed upon us. And we're able to survive the great expanse of space. If we can do that, what else can we do? There's one thing I could say to people who have Saturn in Aries in their birth charts. It would be that there was nothing easy about that placement. It's difficult. It's potentially dangerous. Breaking the rules, defying limitations, disregarding consequences. Sometimes the rules need to be broken. Sometimes we don't know what our limitations truly are until we defy them, until we push beyond the reasonable or even what we would call sane. While we can stay safe by playing by the rules or acknowledging the hardness of the walls that surround us, or accept it when we're told that there will be consequences. If we break through, we can become prisoners to those things. We can become prisoners to logic and what seem to be hard laws or boundaries or structures. But we don't necessarily know that there's a whole other world of possibilities on the other side until we accept the risk or accept the potential consequences for defying them, potentially breaking them. Sometimes you have to, in a sense, burn the bridge behind you, cut off your own retreat in order to find out what's actually on the other side. While I assume that everybody knows who Tony Hawk is, I realize that a lot of people watching this might not have been born when Tony Hawk was world famous in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. So for those of you who don't know, Tony Hawk is a professional skateboarder, and it was his and his contemporaries' disregard for gravity or the risk of getting hurt in will to push beyond what was accepted as possible to do on a skateboard that showed us what could be done on a skateboard.
I knew I was going to make it happen or I was going to get severely injured, because it wasn't going to be me quitting. I guess I'm not saying like I was definitely going to, kill myself doing it. No, I knew that I was going to get hurt enough that it wasn't going to allow me to try again. Exhaustion was not going to be the exit.
Here's where I also put on my cautionary Saturn and Capricorn hat and caveat my extolling of the virtues of Saturn and Aries with the recognition that it does tend to work out a lot better when Saturn is supported by other planets, which I'm pretty sure all the examples that we end up exploring, that tends to be the case. So while I'm not trying to discourage anybody who doesn't have Saturn and Aries, especially well aspected or supported by other planets, I do have to offer my words of caution that in, say, the example of the massive popularity of extreme sports like skateboarding throughout the 90s, but especially during the late 90s when Saturn was in Aries, that while there were absolutely some who were inspired by Tony Hawk and his contemporaries to push themselves, to test their own capacity on a skateboard, a lot of us got ourselves terribly injured, and it just wasn't for everyone. And naturally, throwing caution to the wind, defying social and natural law doesn't always work out for everyone and can be very risky. So that's why I would highly recommend either seeking the counsel of a skilled astrologer or learning how to assess the condition of a given planet in your chart before embarking on any extreme adventures with your Saturn and Aries. It may, in your case, prove to be more conducive to a positive outcome if you observe a little more caution or exercise a bit of restraint when it comes to the area of your life or areas of your life influenced by Saturn and Aries, either within the context of a natal placement or by transit. Because even when it works out, or Saturn and Aries leads you to success and fame and riches, sometimes that can come at a hefty price. And a good example of that would be Hunter S. Thompson, who had Saturn in Aries rising in his chart, in his first house. Hunter S. Thompson was a sports journalist who became known for his very unique, subjective approach to journalistic writing, which very much broke with convention at the time. But he became especially well known for his first book, Hell's Angels, which was the product of him spending a year living with the Hell's Angels biker gang, where he immersed himself in biker culture, which as a whole is a kind of culture that is rugged, tough, rebellious against authority, encompasses a rather anarchic and sometimes violent lifestyle. Certainly not the case for all bikers, but certainly the case for the Hells Angels in the 60s. And his fame really kind of rose to its greatest height with his book, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which was eventually adapted into a film starring Johnny Depp in 1998 when Saturn was in Aries, which essentially revolved around a fictional story that was very much rooted in his real-life experience, depicting his alter ego going on a drug-fueled bender through Las Vegas, engaging in all manner of excess and debauchery, which was in name a quest for the American dream, but in fact revealing the hypocrisy and depravity and excess inherent to the American dream. If you pursue the dream of freedom and abundance to its natural extent, you get something that is totally unhinged and rather excessive. And while for Hunter S. Thompson, it was his ability to reach the boundary of common sense and engage in dangerous and debaucherous behavior that made him famous, that made him successful, but he was pushed to outdo himself with every book that came after it, which he never quite achieved. And his process for writing often involved excessive and increasingly large amounts of drugs, which had consequences later on in his life.
I have to be a person who does most things to excess. And so it just would, be normal that I'd do it with drugs. I'm pretty selective, and I've learned a lot.
Yeah.
And maybe I've burnt my mind up, maybe I've gone crazy, maybe I've destroyed myself. But it doesn't worry me too much right now.
The essence of Saturn in Aries can best be encapsulated by the image of a ram facing off against a brick wall. Saturn in Aries can often compel us or put us in situations where we either must or feel like we must charge headlong into a flat, hard surface. And in that situation, either your head or the wall will break, possibly both. While you may discover that you have a very hard head capable of tearing down walls, there's also a high probability of discovering just how squishy and soft your head really is. So now that I think we've established what Saturn in Aries is about, let's take a look at what that might mean for this period ahead. And at minimum, I think we can expect some version of the pattern that we have seen historically when Saturn has been in Aries, and that is often a failure or breakdown of the status quo, of the normative social order, which for some can be liberating. Sometimes those old structures need to be broken down. Sometimes when people start careening headlong into walls, we discover that those walls were actually made out of cardboard, that they weren't that durable, and the things which we had built on top of them or around them fall apart too. There's very often a breakdown of the rule of law on some level in different parts of the world, which leads to questioning of authority. It doesn't tend to be a great time for leaders, so we often see leaders making really big mistakes or trying to implement policy or impose an agenda on society, which leads to backlash or social upheaval, protests, riots, sometimes open conflict or war. You very often see an uptick in the number of wars going on in the world when the international order is fragile or lacking in central leadership. Nations or leaders of nations start feeling like it's a good time to take a chance at trying to conquer their neighbors. And I think it's something that we're already kind of seeing now, but I would expect to see more of, is this kind of breakdown of the international social order and the internal social order within different countries, not naming any in particular. Sometimes we have to tear down the old system to see what else can be built in its place. But initially, what you always get when there is a collapse or breakdown of government-enforced social order is that in that vacuum, other figures come in to take its place. Unfortunately, it's not freedom and liberation for us all. It's often somebody else with a big stick or some other form of power which it can exert into that vacuum in order to take its place. And it doesn't tend to be a great time to start long-standing structures. So you get kind of a chaotic king of the hill period where different groups or leaders are competing for dominance in that space, that power vacuum. And unfortunately, Saturn's co-presence with Neptune is not likely to be a stabilizing factor. In fact, it's likely to make the sort of slipshod rules and structures that we try to put together in place of crumbling ones are rather porous. And often with Neptune and Aries, there's a kind of a romanticizing or idealizing of conflict as a means of solving problems. You may find that different groups of people are more willing to enter into conflict than usual, more willing to disregard consequences and take a shot at winning it all. And it's not likely to be a short, indecisive dispute. It's one that may drag on for some time. Now, this doesn't mean that it's going to be chaos reigning supreme everywhere or on all levels. And much of what we're getting in this first iteration of Saturn and Neptune and Aries is going to be a kind of preview of events and themes which will become more established and consistent when Saturn enters Aries in February of 2026 for the next couple of years. So my advice is to take a look at what happens over this summer of 2025. And when making decisions about your own life, look at the part of your life represented by Aries. If it's the third house, if you're an Aquarius rising, maybe there's a kind of breakdown in the local order in your neighborhood or town. Maybe the mayor gets caught in a scandal and an investigation begins, but it may start during the summer and then there's a sort of period of reckoning or assessing the damage and perhaps debate over what kind of new order can be imposed on the situation. And depending on other factors, chaos can be a good time to throw your hat in the ring. But my general advice is not to try to rush to the top of the pyramid too quickly, because whoever's at the top is likely to be a target for the next few years, and you don't necessarily want that to be you. It may be more beneficial to slowly position yourself within different points of a situation as things unfold, but I generally don't recommend going full speed. Now, for many of us, we may experience the Saturn and Aries transit as an experience of that kind of pressure in that area of our lives. The pressure to do more than you have time or energy for. You may be asked to commit to something that may require a lot more time and energy than you are expecting. We may see figures in that part of our lives show up that have these characteristics, that act without thinking about consequences or impose unreasonable demands on us. And for most of us, it's really going to be a matter of just exercising discernment about the sort of commitments we take on or the expectations that we have for ourselves or others in those areas.
Through my years of wild success that I never really dreamed of, I got a little caught up in it and I was chasing every opportunity. I was traveling a lot and not present for my family. And at some point, I realized my priorities need to shift. And I definitely learned to say no to a lot of requests in terms of financial or otherwise that would just take up my time and monopolize my mindset. I thought that naively that I had to commit myself fully to skateboarding to make that successful. And I don't.
Because you're just likely to find yourself more at risk for burning yourself out in your activities in that part of your life, or pushing the people or structures in place in those areas of your life past the breaking point. And while we may be able to learn from those failures and have the opportunity to develop persistence and to take more risks in those areas of our lives, which may prove beneficial, you'll want to be especially cautious if Saturn is making a hard aspect to planet in your chart. You want to watch out for situations where circumstances are demanding you to front load your energy or your time or your assets on the hope or promise that on the other side, there will be a solution or a prize that we can't quite see yet or that we're imagining. I think for most of us, it's going to be important to keep a reserve because a lot of those goals or promises of success have the fog of Neptune around them. They're maybe not quite what they seem. Or even our gas tank has the fog of Neptune where we think that we're 3/4 full, but we're actually on E. So keep a spare tank of gas, metaphorically or maybe literally. much of what preparing for Saturn in Aries will look like for most of us is sort of baby-proofing that part of our lives a little bit. Having some redundancies or reserves so that if we crash and burn, we have something to fall back on. So I would say unless you have Saturn very well aspected in your chart, or things in your chart are very well configured to Saturn, those sort of all or nothing gambles are more risk than they're worth. Now, I would say especially for those of you who are having their Saturn return, but also if Saturn will be transiting planets you have in Aries or making hard aspects to planets you have in cardinal signs, while the method for remediation usually needs to be tailored to the particular conditions of Saturn or those planets in your chart. You really can't go wrong with every Saturday on the day of Saturn, ideally at Saturn's hour. Take some time to tune in to Saturn and meditate on your personal connection with Saturn. And through that process, you can start to get clarity on what it is that Saturn is actually doing both in your chart and through this transit. And you can gain insights on how to navigate that part of your life. And if you pair this Saturday ritual meditation with just fasting from sun up to sundown on Saturday, you can sort of calm down Saturn in that part of your life and allow some space for clarity to come through. Because really clarity is what we're going to be wanting as we're dealing with Saturn. It's not going to feel especially clear for most of us at the beginning what exactly is going on in that part of our lives. And we may feel pressure to respond without all the facts in. And if you're really worried about this transit, one of the best things you can do is offer your time or other resources to Saturnian figures in the world, in your life. You can donate to charities or organizations which support the elderly or those in poverty or those who have disabilities, or if you want to give it an especially Saturn and Aries flavor, you can offer your time or money to organizations or charities that support elderly veterans or perhaps those with head injuries, because Aries is related to the head. These are types of remediation that are not going to do any harm, regardless of different specific factors in your chart, but will always be of some benefit. Now with that, I'm going to call it a wrap on this video on Saturn and Aries. If you are expecting your Saturn return, or really stressed about what this transit might be for you, you can book a reading with me at KylePierceAstrologer.com. Minimum, I can give you some perspective on what that is likely to show up for you, what kind of things you need to watch out for. And if you're interested, we can structure a remediation practice for you specifically that will help mitigate or offset the negative potential of that transit and help tap you into some of the potential opportunities that it might bring. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.